and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going back to the 1850s, and we're going to look at a time when the United States was probably the most divided it has ever been. You know, we look on TV and on the internet at Washington, D.C. today, and we think, man, it's bad. But when you go back to the 1850s and that 10 years leading up to the Civil War, things were not only deeply divided over the issue of the expansion of slavery into the Western territories and the new states being carved out of those Western territories, but things got horribly violent during this period, especially, for example, in Kansas. And as we're going to see today, even in the United States Senate.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that we just have a hard time understanding. Well, I guess I would have to preface that before January the 6th, because we've always seen the United States Senate or the House of Representatives, the White House, any of those places as hallowed buildings with people that maybe do not agree with one another, but agree to disagree. They do it respectfully. And what I've noticed, you know, we've talked about this in previous podcasts, that the political temperature is just so bad these days, where we're starting to see images and we see videos and we hear things that we never thought possible. And I think that is because, you know, this is a unique time period that we're living in now, very similar to the time period that was, as you just mentioned, leading up to the Civil War. Our nation is probably just as divided now as it was back then, not really over the same issues, or maybe it is over the same issues, but, you know, we're starting to see that rhetoric rise to the point where people have kind of forgot about the works of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., in which it was, you know, civil disobedience, you know, where you can go against something, but you do it with civility. You do it with, you know, respect and proper discourse. But Ray, you know, January 6th and on in our society today, but also, you know, especially in the 1850s with the Compromise of 1850 and Bleeding Kansas and those things, the senators, they were out literally for blood to get what they wanted, because they had personal interest in this, but they also were representing a very divided country in a particular point in time in which they felt they had to do what they had to do to keep America whole or united, I guess you could say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they were doing what each senator from different districts and different states, of course, was doing what they thought they needed to do. And there are two incidents that I think we're going to focus on today. The first one happened in 1850. The second one happened 6 years later in 1856. But at the end of the day, they're really about the same issue. Even though they're 6 years apart, they're really about the same issue, and that is this issue over slavery. Slavery was, of course, a major dividing issue during the Constitutional Convention, so much, of course, that they had to come up with this 3/5 compromise. And then, of course, throughout the early part of America, you know, it would raise its head every now and then, but it was sort of I guess you could say, Chris, the 800-pound gorilla sitting in the middle of the room that people just did not want to deal with.
Yeah, because you know it's there, but it's kind of like that. And we do the same thing. We just kind of wish it away, or we put our heads under the sand and we just hope that it will go away. But there's a lot of things that are going on during this period. I mean, not just politically, but you can just look at the rise of America, the expansion of America. You know, I mean, of course, you've got westward expansion, which is a huge thing. That is troubling for people in the South and even people in the North, who have kind of built their careers and their lives basically on a monopoly of specific goods and services. And now you're talking about people moving westward, which is going to, you know, change the dynamics of where you live. And especially when you you start looking at these first individuals, Thomas Hart Benton, who had the old nickname Old Bullion, and a senator from Missouri, but also was actually born in North Carolina and went to school at the University of North Carolina. And, it is interesting to me as we start looking at Benton and then, Henry Foote, that a lot of these guys, which I don't know what this says, Ray, but a lot of these guys were lawyers in addition to being senators. And they are determined to fight to get the victory, and they'll do it at all cost. And I'll mention Benton. I know you're going to talk about Foote also, but Benton, his prime concern was the westward expansion of the United States, and he really didn't want that. He was concerned. And you think about the cotton, you think about the other aspects of that, and he's afraid that he's going to lose a lot of money. And he also, if I'm not mistaken, he once owned slaves. Now he'll later change his viewpoint on that, which once again, changing your viewpoint on that in the South will create issues as well. So, Benton is coming in with a lot of thoughts and a lot of beliefs, but he's also going against another individual who is directly the opposite.
Yeah, and of course, like you said, it's the western expansion, and the North is bothered by the fact that the South wants to take their slaves with them. Mm-hmm. Southerners, when they expand into those western territories and those western states, they want to take those slaves with them. The North, I don't know that I want to say they were perfectly happy to leave slavery where it was in the South, though it certainly seems that that's what they wanted to do. I don't know if the phrase "perfectly happy" is the right way to word it, but they were content with leaving slavery in the South. And of course, the South wanted to move slavery further and further west. And of course, one of the big proponents of that was a guy, Vice President of the United States at one point, John Calhoun. John Calhoun was a major proponent, not just simply of slavery, but also of the expansion of slavery. And he has died in March of 1850. I think he dies toward the end of the month, like March 31st of 1850. And following this, Millard Fillmore, who at this point is the Vice President of the United States, he goes before the Senate and basically says, guys, I'm disappointed in you. When I became president of the Senate, I didn't think I was going to have to be calling people to order. I didn't think I was going to have to remind people that you are senators of the United States of America. And of course, you look at someone like Thomas Benton or Foote, who we're getting ready to talk about here in a minute, Harry Foote of Mississippi. These guys are, as you said, Chris, they are the issue of Western expansion and slavery into the Western territories wasn't just simply something that they woke up one day and said, I think this is going to be a very important. No, this was something they felt deeply and strongly about, to the point where they were literally ready to go fisticuffs over it. Now, Harry Foote, of course, is of Mississippi. He is a pro-slavery advocate, just like John Calhoun was. And he's not likely to take any attempt to restrict the expansion of slavery nicely. He's going to push back against that.
And Henry Foote, he played a key role in securing the Compromise of 1850, which was a huge thing. And I think we've talked about this in previous episodes about how the Compromise of 1850 was, this balance of, one state in with slaves, one state in without slaves, to try to keep the peace, I guess, to try to, as you mentioned earlier, to ignore something, to put your head in the sand, just hoping that, well, maybe this compromise will work. And so Foote, he is one of the key contributors in making the Compromise of 1850 happen. However, Thomas Benton refuses to support the compromise. And not only does he refuse to support the compromise, he is extremely offended by the words of Foote that he's giving during the debate. The senators would go to the floor. They would share why you should support a resolution, why you shouldn't support a resolution, and what starts happening is Foote, who was a very hot-headed person in already, he had a temper. And if somebody did not support his views, he did not take kindly to it. And so instead of focusing on the issue, he was very verbal in direct attacks towards Thomas Benton. And, there was some heated debates. And when we say heated debates, I think, Ray, it's fair to say that they probably stopped talking about the Compromise of 1850 and they started mostly focusing on, well, your mama this and your mama that. That's basically what starts happening.
And I think that's what Millard Fillmore is complaining about is, I'm the vice president of the United States, the president of the Senate, you're senators. This is allegedly the upper house of Congress. And I'm in here trying to, herd cats, basically.
And there's no TV, right? I mean, it's not like made for TV. It's not an episode of Cops or anything like that. But what you do have is you have journalists that are in the building. They're writing this down to go take back to, newspapers and to other organizations and letting them know what's going on. And so, one of the things that happens with this is that you continue to have these verbal attacks. And Henry Foote gets so mad at Benton that he moves beyond verbal attacks and then moves towards physical attacks. And as one historian puts it, that Foote was so enraged with Benton that he pulled out a pistol. Now, we can go back and talk about duels, and I believe that Foote had been involved in I think 4 previous duels, 3 of which he was injured in, which I don't know why he continued to do this, but I guess that just shows the type of person that he was.
The whole duel thing just doesn't make sense to me anyway.
No, but especially after one, you would think, okay, now I know what this is all about. I think I'll pass. It's kind of like riding a roller coaster. You might sit there and say, wow, that looks fun. You get on it. It's like, okay, never again. Did it once. I'm good. But here's a duel. Somebody's shooting at you. I think after one time you would realize, okay, probably not something I'll do again.
Not a good way to spend a Saturday morning.
Right. And so, but now we're in the Senate and what Foote does is he actually draws a pistol. Now, what I think is fabulous, and I just wish there would have been cameras during this time, because if the historian is correct as to what happened, the illustration that comes about is kind of this thing of Benton, and I kind of see Superman in this mood because he basically like rips his shirt off and shows his bare chest and basically says, come at me, you big guy, you tough guy. And and next thing you know, Ray, we have a royal rumble taking place on the Senate floor,
or at least very close to it. Benton, of course, had approached Foote. Foote pulls out a pistol, which, there's been some controversy in recent years about should legislators have guns on Capitol Hill. And I guess this particular event maybe says it's probably not a very good idea, folks, when you've got heated debates and people who have very deep disagreements. And like you said, Benton, stands up in all his righteous indignation and, like you said, rips his shirt open and gives this little speech about how I don't have a gun. Let the assassin shoot me. And, it's not funny, but in a way it is. But you know what? At the end of the day, when this all settled and everything sort of got back to normal, whatever was normal at that particular point in time, the Senate actually did launch an investigation into this event. And they found that Foote had acted in self-defense.
Well, yeah. And I think, the end of the story basically is this. Foote basically charges him with his bare hands, instead of the gun. And they do wrestle each other to the floor. There's this wrestling and basically other senators. And Ray, just put in our mind, when we think about these senators, these are like old dudes. It's not like they're young guys, all buff and all of that. So you've got this, these old guys that start wrestling with one another.
Well, every once in a while, we haven't seen this in the United States Congress in recent years, thankfully, but every once in a while, you'll see these type of things happen in other countries where Somebody insults somebody's mama, and the next thing you know, they're slapping each other and going at it. And I don't want to see this return to the United States Senate, or House, but it had to be an event to witness for sure.
Yeah, and so these other senators, they wrestled Foote to the floor, and they were able to take the gun away, and the next thing they lock it in a drawer, and we say, okay, well, we'll never see that happen again. That was a sight to behold, as you said, but it's over with. But Ray, that's just the beginning, because it's not just those two that involve themselves in a theatrical production of mayhem at the Senate. You start to see other people that basically continue to be so strong in their views that they're willing to do whatever it takes to get their point across.
Yeah, it's going to be 4 years later, roughly, when another senator by the name of Stephen Douglas gets a new act passed through Congress called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And as we said, this is going to deal again with the issue of the expansion of slavery into these Western territories and these territories that are going to become states. And what the Kansas-Nebraska Act did, it allowed something called popular sovereignty. That Kansas mainly, but also Nebraska, though there was no thinking that Nebraska was going to be a pro-slavery state. The real issue was Kansas. And under popular sovereignty, the idea was that the people of Kansas would be able to choose whether they would be a free state or whether they would be a slave state. Well, when this actually passes and becomes law, what happens in Kansas is a civil war. Often referred to, of course, as Bleeding Kansas, as border ruffians, pro-slavery border ruffians just pour into the state. Of course, anti-slavery people are pouring into the state as well. And the state is just divided in this bloody civil war. And of course, this is going to negatively impact President Franklin Pierce, who had signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And he's, only going to serve one term. The Democrats come back. They nominate a guy called James Buchanan, who actually wins the election. I believe it was 1856, was it?
Mm-hmm.
The election of 1856. He actually wins that election. And even today, when you look at, historians and political scientists will get together every few years and they will discuss the worst presidents and the best presidents in American history. Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan are going to top the worst president list every single time. They're some of the worst presidents in American history because a lot of what was going on during this period, they didn't do anything to help. In fact, they did things that made the situation even worse. But it's in the context of all of this that in May of 1856, in the U.S. Senate, yet again, the U.S. Senate, Massachusetts' Charles Sumner takes the stand in the U.S. Senate, and he gives this 2-day oration that's commonly referred to as Crimes Against Kansas. And in this oration, he's not just simply, as you mentioned earlier, talking about the issue, he also takes aim at people around him, people he sees around him who he disagrees with. And one of those is South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler. And Butler has he's like you said earlier, these are not young people. These are not 20, 30 somethings or even 40 somethings. These are older people. And Butler had a stroke. So of course, he's not physically able really to respond to Sumner. But Sumner just sort of blasts away at him, and that is going to lead to the second act of senatorial violence that's going to occur in the days following Sumner's speech.
Yeah, and that's the one thing that I remember you were talking about is that the speech that Sumner gets, I mean, he just goes off on the medical disabilities, if you will, of Preston Brooks. And there's a lot of other things that basically drives this. I mean, there's issues of race baiting that comes into this when you start looking at where they're from and some of the other things that are going on. You've got the issue of slavery that is coming. There's also these sexually charged accusations that come about. And, one of the things I remember is that Stephen Douglas, who was one of the senators from Illinois, people know him from, his contest with Abraham Lincoln. But Douglas basically said in one of the speeches, the quote that he basically said is, quote, "This damn fool is going to get himself killed by some other damn fool." And that's basically what
you talking about, Sumner?
Yes. and that's so, and the thing is that they're absolutely right in that exactly is what's about to happen. And you've got Preston Brooks, who comes into this. He is a House of Representatives. So right now we're getting the Senate and the House involved, because Preston Brooks is Butler's first cousin. And he finds out, and he was like, oh no, he didn't. He didn't talk about my buddy like that. We ain't gonna play that
about
game.
My uncle like that.
Exactly. And so what he decides to do is he says, well, I'm going to challenge Sumner to a duel, because that's the best way that we can fix this. And, he says, okay, how do I do it? What's the thing? And so he gets advice, and he finds out that dueling is the better way to approach this. And maybe they even talked about, hey, you remember 4 years ago, those two idiots that fought on the Senate floor, probably shouldn't do that. But what you can do is you can actually do a duel, and that would work, except there was a problem. And the problem is that Brooks said, well, Sumner's not a gentleman. And since dueling is for gentlemen, it ain't going to work, because all he is just a drunk old fool. And so dueling is not the right way. And so what they decide to do is they come up with the idea that the best way to humiliate Sumner is not through dueling, but beating him upside the head in a public setting, in what is known as caning.
Yeah, and Preston Brooks, I don't know how old he was. I should have looked this up. I don't know how old Preston Brooks was at the time, but he was obviously younger than his uncle Andrew Butler. But he walks into the United States Senate. I mean, again, wish there were cameras here for this moment, video cameras. I want this on YouTube, Chris. Okay. He walks into the United States Senate with this cane, and he goes up to Charles Sumner's desk in the Senate, where Sumner is working, and he basically accuses him of libel against the state of South Carolina. And of course, he's also, let's be honest, like you said, this man had gone up there and not just talked smack about his state, but talked smack about his uncle, and he's mad. So he proceeds to beat the snot out of Charles Sumner. This is not funny. I don't know why I'm laughing. To beat the snot out of Charles Sumner with his cane. I mean, he does it, and he doesn't just whap him a few times. That was like 31 hits.
Well, and I think there's something else to it, because remember that Brooks wanted to do what's known as a gentleman's duel. So he wanted to do the duel, but he knew Sumner wasn't good enough. But Brooks still considered himself to be a gentleman, in that he made sure that majority of the galleries were clear, and they also made sure that there were no women that were present, that were going to be there to watch. But Ray, you're exactly right. Not only did he hit him with his walking stick, but he hit him with it had a gold head on it. And that's what he used. And it was so strong that Sumner immediately becomes blind by it. I mean, this is not just a little tap, tap, tap. I mean, he just whacks him, and just to basically, to the point where he was almost unconscious. But it isn't funny, but, Sumner was knocked down. And to add to the embarrassment of it, Sumner becomes trapped under the heavy desk that is bolted to the floor. And, so basically he can't get out from underneath the desk. And so, it's like whack-a-mole. And, some moves this, he moves his head, then he pops back up, moves his head and pops back up. And, he's trying to get away. And he basically has to rip the desk from the floor to get away from Brooks. And he's bloodied. And remember, this is taking place on the Senate floor. And, near the end of the attack, Sumner basically will collapse unconscious. And there's even research or historians who say that he bellowed like a calf, is what they say. So, I mean, this is just pure embarrassment, which is exactly what Brooks wanted for Sumner, but to the point where you had to get senators, you had to get representatives who were trying to break this up. And finally, there was another guy who pulls out a gun, who basically says, let them be, let them be, let them alone, let them keep fighting, and I mean, basically it took another senator who went to him and said, listen, don't kill the guy. Don't kill the guy. You need to stop. You need to break this up. And so, Ray, they finally are able to restrain Brooks. And then what does he do? He just takes his cane and he just walks out.
Yeah. And you would think this might have ended his political career here, Brooks. But it doesn't. People in the South, Southern whites, are proud of him. While you have Northerners who call this an act of Southern cowardice, you have Southerners who are just beaming with pride over what Preston Brooks has done. Now, he does resign the House of Representatives, but what is interesting is he is shortly thereafter reelected to the House of Representatives. But what I find interesting about this whole thing, Chris, is that he broke his cane. He was hitting Sumner so hard he broke his cane. People throughout the South began mailing him new canes, to replace the one he broke upside Sumner's head. It's just a very interesting thing that you have this event of violence that goes down, and Sumner, he's severely injured. I mean, he's grievously injured, and he's out for a little while. I forgot how long he was out for.
Well, and to add to it, I think the other interesting thing about the broken cane is that they picked up the pieces of the cane and that they started wearing them. People that support, as you said, Brooks, they took the little pieces and they made like rings out of them, and they were jewelry, and they started putting them on their necks, and they basically saw them as sacred relics. And that's how serious a situation this was. By the way, Brooks needed medical attention also in this as well. And the reason that he needed medical attention was because he hit himself in the head when he was in one of his backswings. He was so full of rage that he actually had a cut over his eye, and he started bleeding pretty strong with that. So, but it just goes to show the reality of what is happening, with this duel and with this divide between Republicans and Democrats and things of that nature. And Brooks actually goes back and says, I never intended to kill Sumner, because if I wanted to have killed Sumner, I sure wouldn't have used my cane. And he actually gives a speech to kind of, well, many people thought he was going to be to apologize, but Brooks actually gets on the floor and of the House, he's on the representative, and he said, I meant no disrespect to the Senate. I meant no disrespect to the United States or to the House by my attack on Sumner. But yet he beat the man upside of his head over and over and over. And Ray, it was to the point, it does need to be said, Brooks was arrested for assault, and he was convicted, and they gave him a fine, which is about $10,000 in today's money. Now, he received no prison sentence, but they tried to remove him from the House, as you mentioned. They tried to expel him, but that failed. And as you mentioned, he did get elected to a new term of office. But if you go back to Sumner, Southerners, I mean, my gosh, this is how bad it was. Southerners began mocking Sumner, saying that he was faking his injuries.
Yeah.
I mean, how, and then they said Brooks should have used a heavier cane because he didn't do enough damage. I mean, where does it stop? I mean, Sumner suffered a serious head trauma. I mean, that some people would say left him with, PTSD. And he, he really wouldn't be able to serve, so they left his seat empty. They didn't fill it. And he did get reelected, but because of his medical injuries, he had to wait 2 more years before he could even do that. So, I mean, Ray, this was a serious situation that we look at it today and we say, surely it didn't happen, but it did.
Oh, it definitely happened. Chris, I want to ask you a question. Because something you said there triggered this, that there were people who said, he faked his injuries. Do you think there are parallels today in our political world to this? I mean, early on in this episode, you mentioned January 6th, but do you think that we are at such a point in American history where this kind of thing could start happening again? Or do you think?
I think yes and no. I don't think that it can come to the point of guns and of canes and things of that nature, but there have been times when there's been sharp words, that have been said. And I mean, what's the old phrase? Sticks and stones, may break my bones, but words will never, hurt me. Well, yeah, they do. And I think that whoever is elected to the office does have enough pride and respect for the office that I don't think it would come to that in today's society. We can talk about January 6th all we want, but really January 6th, the actions were done by individuals who were not representatives. They were not elected officials. Did elected officials through words, maybe they contributed to that. That's a whole nother thing. But as far as the actual violence and defacing and all the things, that wasn't elected officials. So I think that there's enough respect in the system that it wouldn't come to that. But you look at Twitter and social media, Instagram and other things, we see that they're using these words to incite other people to do the violence. I think that's how it's changed instead of the representatives, because who wants to lose their job as a senator or representative for doing something stupid like that? But if you get on Twitter and you say something and you get other people to do something, well, then you're hailed as a martyr, which is what happened. I mean, you've got Southerners who saw Brooks as this hero, and others saw Sumner as a martyr. So yeah, I think you do see it, but just not in the violent way that it's out there. What do you think?
I agree. I think we haven't seen this type of violence among elected representatives in the United States in recent history. I don't know that we will see it, but like you said, I think it's a good point that they may use outlets to indirectly influence some people to take up violent measures for them, whether they mean to do it or not. I mean, they may not even mean to do it. It just may be, if you get enough people reading a tweet or reading a post of some sort, you're going to have somebody in that group who's going to be unstable enough to actually, take some sort of violent action. So I think you're probably right on that.
But I do think that the lesson to be learned is, we've been taught all along that respect will always win the day.
Yeah.
And there can be nothing, and this is just my opinion, but there can be nothing that is so egregious that you resort to doing something like that. Violence is never the answer. I mean, I mentioned, Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi, who advocated that there was wrong in society, but they found civil ways to go against that which was being done wrong to them. And I still think that's the way that it needs to be done, is that you should speak up for things that are wrong. You have every right to speak up for things that are wrong. But that's why we have laws. That's why we have voting. That's why we have, there's ways civilly that you can go about changing the wrong that is being done in our society. But, Ray, many people, they look at the Senate and the House and they think that's just a bunch of boring thing that, watch C-SPAN. There's nothing going on. It means nothing. And nowadays, maybe listeners to our podcast, when they read the news and they say there was a fight going on in the Senate, yesterday as Republicans and Democrats fought for control of spending, they'll say, fight's not really the right choice of words, because I remember, according to a podcast that I listened to, when there was a real fight that took place. And it was a whole lot different than it is today. So history you didn't know, but should.
History you didn't know, but should. Thanks, Chris, for another great episode. We hope our listeners have enjoyed this episode of History You Didn't Know, but should. Please make sure to like this podcast, share it with your friends and family. You can always contact us through email at historyyoushouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know @gmail.com. Or you can look us up on Twitter or Facebook. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
Talk to you later.